Welcome to this edition of the CHDS Thesis Series. With me today is David Green, Lieutenant from San Bernardino Police Department. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Let's start with the title of your thesis.
Title of my thesis is A Different Shade of Blue, and the subtitle is An Evaluation of the Civilian Detective Concept and its Impact on Police Capabilities.
And what drove you to that topic?
I work for the city of San Bernardino. At the time that I joined this program, San Bernardino had filed for bankruptcy. It was one of three larger cities in California to have filed a public bankruptcy. And as a result, we were losing personnel. We were resorting to some unconventional means to try to maintain operational capabilities. And one of the concepts that we had employed was the use of civilians to perform detective duties, whereas in the past they had only performed more supportive roles to law enforcement. We plunged them into this primary role. And so when I joined the program, I really wanted to take a look and somewhat settle the lack of consensus as to whether it's a good idea or a bad, whether the concept is viable or not.
And how prevalent is it, actually?
It's not very prevalent. I ended up taking a look at 9 agencies that I was able to identify had implemented the policy. And during the course of my research, I learned that there were a few more out there, but it is not very prevalent at all.
And can you go over the basics of what the difference in training would be?
The traditional training for a sworn law enforcement officer entails a police academy, which, depending on jurisdiction, could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months. It then entails a field training program, which again can be anywhere from 2 months to 6 months, depending on the agency. And then traditionally, a police officer will have served a couple of years in the field performing emergency response duties before they either transition into the role of detective or promote into that role, dependent on the structure of their individual organization. A civilian detective is hired directly into that investigative role as a new employee. And currently, the training for civilian detectives averages around 2 weeks of formalized training, and then another 1 or 2 months of informal training. But there's not a lot of consistency in how that's been applied, and that was one of the findings of my research.
And did they have to have a certain background in order to qualify to be hired in at that level?
They do, but that is currently determined by the hiring agency. There is no current standard issued by either a state accrediting commission and there is no national standard.
And so the research that you've conducted in the thesis, looking at the positives and the negatives, what are some of the other capabilities of these detectives that help the sworn?
Where they help, it's not so much how they help the sworn as to how they help, as much as it is how they help the operation of the department. They are performing similar duties to a traditional sworn detective, but they are doing so at a lower compensation rate, and it takes lesser time to train a civilian, to both hire and train a civilian, and that's where the benefit comes into the agency.
And what are some anecdotes of how that has worked in different agencies?
Well, one of the unsettled issues with civilian detectives is whether or not they can, in fact, do the job of a regular detective. There are limitations. Civilian detectives cannot carry guns. They do not possess arrest powers, and so they can't engage in duties that would be deemed physically dangerous. But when you look at the average or the day-to-day duties of the makeup of the duties of a detective's work week, you find that the percentage of time that a detective is engaged in physically dangerous or hazardous duties or initiating arrests, it really comprises a very small percentage of detective work. And so the vast majority of detective work can in fact be completed by a civilian if they're properly trained. Some of the anecdotes that emerged during this research were related both to public safety and homeland security as well. One of the scenarios that was described to me was out of Peoria, Arizona. And the city of Glendale, Arizona had hosted the Super Bowl a few years ago. Peoria is a neighboring agency, and as a result of the influx of Super Bowl tourists or Super Bowl patrons, Peoria had surged its presence in the field, its sworn presence in the field, and they were able to still maintain the continuity of operations in their detective bureau by staffing it with civilian detectives to perform the core responsibilities and keep the bureau running while enhancing their presence in the field. Another example of where civilians had performed a critical duty came out of the December 2nd incident in San Bernardino during the attack on the Inland Regional Center. Initially, there was some very limited information about the suspects in that case. There was limited information on the suspect vehicle. And one of the first major breaks in that case was developed by a civilian who was able to link the suspect vehicle to the suspect, Farouk, who was later identified and located. And her ability to do that enabled officers to track down Farouk quite a bit sooner than might have otherwise occurred. So that example spoke to the fact that civilians can perform a very critical role in ongoing investigations.
So what recommendations do you have for that emerged from your research?
I came out with 3 recommendations, and the first arose from a gap in the research that I was not able to fill, and that is really nailing down the exact percentage of time that physically dangerous duties and arrests take or comprise detective work. I think that further research needs to be done on that, because once that can be identified, it will give city managers and police chiefs some hard data to work with in advocating for an audit or a proposal for this type of policy in their organization. My second recommendation is that the Department of Justice sponsor the development of a national framework for policy adoption. The roles of police officer, police detective, and other civilians in law enforcement, such as dispatchers or forensic technicians, it's very well known, very well defined. But the role of a civilian detective, the scope of practice for a civilian detective is not well known. And I think that needs to be established by a credible public policy institute. And I believe that the Department of Justice could sponsor and fund that type of research and policy framework. The third recommendation that I came out with was that the individual state peace officer accrediting commissions develop a standardized guideline for training and for certification for civilian detectives, just as they do for police officers currently.
What are the impediments to the implementation of your research?
The impediments currently are the lack of consensus as to whether or not it's a viable concept or not. And the impediments are also largely cultural within the law enforcement industry. There is a standing perception that only a sworn police officer with experience as a police officer can perform an adequate investigation, or that only an officer can have the types of skills and understandings necessary to conduct effective criminal investigations. My recommendations, as I stated earlier, were that the Department of Justice sponsor the creation of a national framework. And I think the only real impediment to that first recommendation is interest. Finding somebody willing to carry that banner, to the Department of Justice and seek sponsorship of that. Secondarily, further research to quantify the rate in which physically dangerous duties or arrests comprise detective work. Again, the only impediment to that is somebody taking interest in it and conducting that research. And then lastly, state peace officer accrediting commissions need to develop the training standards and the certifications for civilian detectives, just as they have for police officers and dispatchers. And I think that the only impediment to that thus far has been the fact that nobody has really pushed for it. So I really don't see any major resistance out there for their recommendations that I've made.
Well, certainly cultural issues can stop everybody in their tracks,
Sure.
but say I'm part of a middle range police department and I do have budgets concerns, but what's in it for us to take on this project of creating spots for civilian detectives?
Well, I think that every agency needs to really take a hard look at what their individual needs are. My thesis is geared toward the police chief or the city manager that is looking at either managing costs or trying to increase capabilities without having to increase costs proportionately. And for individuals in those circumstances, it is worth looking at the needs of their agency to see if this is a policy that would work for them, that would suit their needs. For the agency that's well-funded and money is not an issue, there's not necessarily a benefit to the policy unless they are having difficulties in recruitment for their sworn personnel. One of the interesting facts that had come out of my research was that some of the agencies that had adopted this policy had not done so out of a financial necessity, but they had done so to broaden the candidate pools that they could recruit from for personnel, because they just weren't finding the type of personnel they wanted in the sworn candidate pools.
So it's a benefit to get better, not better, but at least more candidates for positions within the police department.
To get more candidates or perhaps find more individuals that have the particular skills that an agency is looking for. Many agencies that do use this policy tend to use these types of investigators for fraud crimes, forgery crimes, crimes where there's less propensity for suspect contact, and where there's more specified or more specific knowledge, or specialized knowledge, I should say, needed for the type of investigation that they're doing. So this policy allows them to look at people with experience in the banking industry, the insurance fraud industry, people with skill sets that would be beneficial to those types of investigations, but people that may not be interested in chasing crooks down dark alleys. But they nevertheless do have something to offer to a police department.
Well, they always say that necessity is the mother of invention, and so
Sure.
How great that you were able to conduct this research out of a need there in San Bernardino and that it turned out positive. Do you have anything that you would recommend for people who take this on as a project within their department? Any bits of wisdom?
I would recommend that that they really do a thorough audit of their investigative division to figure out where their needs lie, and to identify those positions that where arrests and the dangerous types of duties don't really comprise a large part of the role, and perhaps look at this as an alternative.
Great. It sounds like a wonderful project, and we'll look forward to seeing how it evolves.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.